Well, good evening again, and I'm Bob Graves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And it's good to be back with you. And tonight will be the final show where I'll be talking about some of the confrontations that I experienced in my life that made me realize that if I was going to be honest, I couldn't continue down what was a more traditional path, and that I had to really pick a different route. And so today I want to talk about, last week I actually talked about some of the personal things, the things that shaped my self-image, the way and it was kind of a personal show. And by the way, I got a lot of response from people that I appreciated. I hope that struck a meaningful and useful chord to you. But in previous weeks, I'd shared some of the intellectual concepts of doctrine and teaching and how some of these things weren't working for me. But last week, speaking about how my sense of self had gone through some radical changes and discoveries about where that sense of self came from. Which, oh, by the way, I've got a series of videos out there you might find interesting, I like the title of the series of videos. When I came up with the title, I said, "Oh, I like that." And it's a series of videos that teach us. It's a teaching on how it is that we actually develop our sense of self. And so I came up with the title, "Just Who Do You Think You Are?" And I like the title. I thought it worked very well. But anyway, you can find those somewhere on Facebook. The videos, just who do you think you are? But anyhow, so last week I talked about the process of how my sense of self experienced a paradigm shift, and how I discovered that the faith, the way that I had understood it and its fabric, was really constructed out of a reflection of the angst of that sense of self that was in many ways very damaged. And how when I came to a healthier sense of self, how that old way of thinking just didn't really serve a purpose or resonate, and it was destined to fall apart. Well, tonight I want to talk about some of the things that don't have anything to do with, say, my sense of self or of the intellectual pursuit of, say, theology and all that, but rather some of the other things that I happen to observe in the context of Christian faith that made me realize I got to think these things through differently. And just from a standpoint of the experience of things from an academic standpoint or just from an experiential standpoint. And I would say that the very first time that I can remember having a significant confrontation with honesty and truth was when I came across some of the books by Charles Finney, which was uh, in some ways almost a chance kind of thing. When I first decided that I wanted to study for the ministry, I was still at that point in time persuaded that some things about Christianity just didn't seem to me to be making sense. But I was of the opinion that chances are the real explanation was that somehow we just weren't taking it seriously enough. At least that was my first theory. And so as I wanted to study for the ministry, my first goal was not to actually be a pastor. I didn't want to be an evangelist either. I wanted to be a revivalist. I really wanted to be somebody who would go about from place to place and somehow be kind of like the equivalent of the motivational speaker, get people excited about their Christianity and really prepared to kind of get serious about it, get busy with it, do it, be it. And so that was something that struck me as something lacking in the Christian community, even, back when I was 18. And so I was thinking, I want to become a revivalist. I didn't know if there's any such position, but that's what I wanted to do. In fact, back then I even met people like Jack Van Impe. And in fact, for a while, I was actually even in conversation with Jack Van Impe about the possibility of even joining with him in some capacity. And nothing came of it, but we did talk about it for a little while. But in that process, I heard about this guy who had a tremendous uh, history of having been an amazing revivalist, and his name was Charles Grandison Finney. And I thought, well, And then when I discovered that he had written several books, or that there were several books about him, I said, well, let's read up on the guy. And that's when I discovered that he was not just a very effective revivalist. He had some thoughts that were kind of counter to the way the mainstream was working. And in fact, there's a great deal of criticism about him. But as I read the things that he wrote, such as his lectures on revival, where he explains legally, philosophically, um, psychologically, experientially, his experience in dealing with the question of revival and people taking their faith and living for God seriously, I began to realize that he was trying to bring something that he called true to faith, true to life, true to reason, and he true to scripture, true to life. I can't remember now. It's been a while. Don't read much of Finney anymore. But anyway, he actually had this quest for honesty. It wasn't the same phrase, but I tell you, when I first met Dr. Jones, I couldn't. He says, this is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty. It kind of reminded me of the fact that Finney was a person who wasn't interested in tradition for tradition's sake, particularly if it didn't really seem to be working. Now, he was a fellow who was actually an attorney, and he was also, I don't know if he was an atheist, but he certainly was not convinced that Christianity had any credibility. Of course, he lived back in a day when everybody pretty much went to church anyway, but he was one of these guys sitting in the back of the church. And he was an attorney, and a difficult attorney. I imagine the kind of guy you wouldn't want to be in court up against. He was amazing in that sense. But he would sit in church, and he would yeah, man, you're crazy. You people don't believe in prayer. I mean, if you believed in prayer, you'd do this, you'd do that. You don't believe in God. If you believed in God, you'd be this, you'd be that. And he found inconsistencies in what these people claimed to believe in the way they lived. And it wasn't, then one day he experienced this powerful sense of the presence of God, and he went through this amazing conversion. And he then began immediately to preach pretty much the same message that he was preaching when he was a naysayer, and where he talked to people about the inconsistency of their lives. Now, getting to become familiar with Finney early on, when I was just getting involved in fundamentalism, was, I think, helpful to me in this respect. Although today I don't think that I would be it's not as if I would have the theology of Finney. Even his theology certainly changed over time. But I saw in him a person who had the courage to stand up against tradition, specifically because he saw that tradition was getting in the way of an authentic faith. And so seeing that modeled in what he was doing, even though I see a lot of other things modeled in what he was doing that I don't think were useful, or things that worked for him in his day because the culture was more open to it, but wouldn't work today. But nonetheless, it modeled for me this sense of priority, that authenticity was more important than tradition. And so that alone, and particularly if he'd been successful as a revivalist, and that's what I wanted to be, he had considerable influence on me, particularly in my openness to listen to tradition and go, I don't buy it. Now, he was accused of being a Pelagianist and this and that, and he certainly got a lot of people upset. And the thing that I find is kind of interesting is that he was actually originally ordained in a tradition that was extremely Calvinistic. And if there's anything that Finney became, was very non-Calvinist. It was kind of funny. He actually, it's almost like he deliberately swam against the current in that. But anyhow, that experience early on gave me the awareness that there have been people in the past who bucked the system. And so when it came time for me to have to buck the system, I was ready to do it. I didn't feel that that would necessarily be, well, the end of my ministry or the end of my effectiveness or the end of my usefulness, or that it was even going to be a wrong thing to do. It was encouraging to me to do that, and I think that it had a huge impact. He had, I read his lectures on revival. He also had some books that were called, systematic theology, but they were really more books about the philosophy of moral government, of moral law, the philosophy of theology. And it was really and very heavily affected by his legal background. But it definitely gave to me a way of seeing how people approach these questions, and with a totally different set of priorities, a totally different set of assumptions, and it was in that way very encouraging. But then one thing that was extremely huge for me that had a big impact was in confronting the way that I saw many people who were Christians saying things and believing things and doing things that were not just against the way the culture was moving, but in a way that just seemed to me to lack the credibility, the the authority, the scholarship, and various things like that. I remember one of the first things, and it was discovering what the fundamentalist community had to say about music. Now, if you know me, you can see these guitars in the back. I've been a guitar player since I was a young kid. And of course, if you know anything about me, you know also I'm a Beatle freak. The Beatles were very influential on me. When I got to Bible school and discovered there for the very first time that there was this concept being taught by people like Bob Larson and what have you, that contemporary rock and roll music and all this other music, it's evil, it's wrong, it's terrible. These people are just awful, awful, awful people, and they've got an awful, awful message. And I think even Jack Chick wrote a track or even a book on it, where claiming such crazy. No, it wasn't Jack Chick. It was one of his cohorts. Some fella, I can't remember his name now, who was running around claiming that all of the people who create records, they sit around and they pray to Satan and they do all this other stuff. Well, anyway, this was a very popular thing back then, and of course, immediately I'm kind of impressionable. I'm young, and I really wanted to be a very useful minister. So, I mean, if there was any truth to this, I wanted to submit to it. And, so I listened to them and the things they had to say and the arguments they had about how, the drugs, the sex, the rebellion, and all the undisciplined lives of these musicians and how horrible it is. And it's a terrible testimony and all this other stuff. When I thought about it, at first they so convinced me that I thought, well, I can't do this. And I actually, I'm kind of sheepish to admit it now. I became so convinced that this music was therefore so bad that I not only got rid of a lot of my records and stuff like that, I actually took my guitars and I burned them. I got rid of them. I wanted to be a man of God. But I got to be honest with you that I really missed them. But not just that, but as I began to take a look at this story, and I really wanted to know more about it, I then studied the history of musicians in general. And I was a little bit disappointed with myself, my ability to quickly jump to a conclusion, my gullibility in being so easily persuaded, when I discovered in studying musicians that throughout all of history, musicians have always been a very kind of over-the-edge, creative, less disciplined, not necessarily always living the best lifestyle kind of people. And this was true whether you're talking about musicians from the classical days of other musicians, with the Baroque period and all this, that many of these gifted musicians of any genre were oftentimes people who, some of them often had some rather interesting lives, and were the kind of people who would make you wonder if they really should be doing that, you know. And when I discovered that this was something that was not only very true of a lot of musicians throughout history, but I also knew that it was not something that was true of me. Although I loved rock and roll, I had no interest in the drug scene and anything like that. Never did. Um, Still don't. But I began to see that they had taken something that was true, even about the music that they condoned, but it wouldn't admit it. And they found out where it was true in the music that they don't condone. And I came totally convinced that this was nothing other than just a cultural bias trying to be explained through the spin of a theology that had no real veracity or credibility behind it. And it took me a while, but I finally grew comfortable with the idea of getting back into the guitar, and then eventually getting back into music in every manner, both sacred and secular. And in fact, where there just wasn't a difference to me. And that experience also in seeing what I saw as the lack of real genuineness and authenticity in the kind of scholarship to condemn something for just cultural purposes. Sure, there are people who, as musicians, do all sorts of things they shouldn't do. Well, they shouldn't do those things, I guess, but that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they were rock musicians, or that they liked the music that kind of moved. It didn't. I failed to see that the connection was all that fabulous. And I got to tell you that since then, I found that although I stayed away from rock and roll for almost 10 years, when I finally got back into it, I found that. I felt that I had a real gift for playing the guitar and for entertaining. And it, for me, became an opportunity that when I was playing, even playing secular music, if people were celebrating, having a good time, we're talking about, marriages and birthday parties and retirements and promotions and the various things that people celebrate and bring music into, that I really felt that I was a part of participating in the celebration of life. And I was able to get back into the music scene in a way where I looked for what was the best in it rather than the worst in it, and invested myself there. And I did that. In fact, I played bass with a band for, I don't know, about close to 10 years, and really enjoyed it. And it was a secular band, and I had no problem being a person who was a person of faith, committed to a life that was supposed to be one that valued the things that are right and love and all that. And I just did not experience any kind of a conflict in doing that. And of course, that experience would, already put me at edge against some of the people who wouldn't agree with that. And in fact, I became a music director of a church, and I was at a conference for music directors, and the guy who was leading this one particular seminar said something that I had often thought myself, but just never thought to actually express it openly. And he said, "I'm telling you, if you really want good music in your church, don't try to find people who are believers and try to turn them into people who can play good music. Because too many times the people who are in your church, all they know how to play are hymns in 4/4 and 3/4. And that's all they can do. You want something syncopated. You want something with soul. You want something that sounds like it came from Motown. These people aren't going to do it. You're going to be better off just going out, finding people who know nothing about God, bring them into the church, see if you can get them converted, and you'll have an awesome band." And I don't know how serious he was, but the truth was I found that many times the people who really excelled at music were people who were focused very much on excelling in music and didn't necessarily have anything to do with coming from the church. But I was able to finally, build up a pretty good you know, a team of people who were working, and uh, we didn't, we were just interested in the music as a form, as a genre, and as a way of expressing things. And I was very fortunate in that the church that I was in at the time gave me carte blanche. I could do anything I wanted, and I pretty much did. And we had a great time. I mean, I would some of the interesting things that we did. For example, was one time the pastor was going to preach a message, and he let me know like 3 or 4 weeks ahead of time what he was planning on speaking on. When I was the music director, and I'd pick out the music and put it together for the services. Sometimes planning on it 3 or 4 weeks ahead, and I knew he was going to be speaking on the temptations of the internet. And he wasn't sure what he was going to call the message, but his working title was, surfing the web with Jesus. So I decided that I was going to do something a little different that Sunday, and I never told the pastor about it at all. In fact, I rarely told him what I was going to do because I wanted it to be a surprise, and it was never bothersome to him. But that particular Sunday, what I did is I took the hymn, Anywhere with Jesus I Can Safely Go, and I did it to the tune of Surfin' USA, and I mean, complete with all the twanging Fender guitars and everything, and we did it as almost an exact copy of the Beach Boys, including all the backup singers and the falsetto and everything, and we just had a riot. We had fun with that, and we could do that, and a lot of people might have thought, well, you shouldn't do that, well, we did. We were looking for other things to do musically, and we just did things because it made sense to do them. It seemed to work, and we just had fun being spontaneous, and we never stopped for a moment to think, oh, but does that music bring glory to God and all that? We just wanted to know, would it connect? Would it work in the moment? Would it help convey the message? Would it help focus on the theme of that day and things like that? So these are things that were very successful, and we were working with them, and I think it also contributed to the fact that hey, I'm not going to do this the way everyone else seems to think that we should. I'm just going to do it in a way that seems to really work, and that continued to lead me down that path. But there were things that were that I became aware of that bothered me a little bit when I began to compare what some of the historical arguments are that the church has been having with the secular world, and I began looking into it. This was something I found very disturbing, very I'm finding the word for it. It was disappointing. There's other words I could use, but I just can't think of them right now. But for example, looking at the way that the church in general dealt with the concept of what the earth is, and as science is discovering more and more about the earth, they're finding themselves arguing with Christians who are opening up their Bibles and basically saying, "Hey, wait a minute, in here it says," which means and so the earth has to be, and then they argue with the scientists. They're saying, "Well, we're discovering that the earth is this and that," but then to make matters worse, here's what I discovered was happening as I looked at the history honestly. Sometimes a scientist would discover something about the earth and express it. And then the first thing you'd know, all of the Christians are saying, "Oh no, you're speaking for Satan. You're doing this. The Bible says such and so, and the Bible says such and so, and you're wrong, and you're leading people astray, and you're destroying their faith." Over time, however, the general population would become aware of the fact that the scientists are right about what they're saying about the earth. And then what happens is that the Christians would not only change their theology, change their interpretation of these verses, they then sweep the history under the rug so that they would then be in agreement with what those scientists were saying, say, 100 years ago, and act as if we were never disagreeing with that. Today, in fact, you can find that you can find some Christians who would almost want to deny that the church ever fought against the flat Earth concept. That the Earth is flat, and various other things. When you read and study what some of the ancient views were from other cultures about what the Earth is like, one of the more common views, for example, that existed in the ancient world where the Bible came from, was the idea that the sky was somehow actually a dome, a solid dome. They didn't know that there's an atmosphere up there and it kind of comes to an end and there's space. They just saw this blue thing up there and they assumed it was a dome, and they thought that the lights kind of sparkled on the dome or whatever at night. And there was a lot of ignorance scientifically about what was going on. And it was believed by many of them that this dome was huge, and it was as if it sat on the mountains roundabout. And that it was almost as if they could believe that if they were to go to the edge of the mountains and go over the mountains, they'd find where the dome actually came down and met the earth. And they had a way of talking about this, and even terminology they used to describe this dome. And this terminology is in the Bible, in talking about the sky, in talking about the heavens, talking about the firmament, and talking about these things. And then you find today a lot of Christians who want to deny that's what those words meant, that the Bible is not talking about this ancient Chaldean view of the way the earth and the sky meet, and the pillars of the earth and all that other stuff. And so there was this denial. So let me see if I can rehearse this again, what I was discovering that I found disturbing. There were numerous different discoveries that would be made from time to time that scientists would say something. The immediate reaction from the church would be, oh, no, you're wrong. Eventually, the scientist would be found to be telling the truth. The church would then change its interpretation. And then it would not only change its interpretation, the church would then go into denying that it was ever on the other side of the argument to begin with. And the church seems to be filled with this lie that in every age they wanted to act as if the only argument we really have with science are the current ones. And this isn't true. Christianity has been arguing with scholarship, secular scholarship, since its inception. There has not been a generation of Christianity that hasn't existed where there was not some issue that they were in disagreement with. And of all these issues, most of them, 95% of them end up being resolved by people just in general coming to believe what the scientists have been saying, and then they change their interpretation. And sometimes when we read the books from the past, we don't realize that we sometimes changed our interpretation but kept the old words, so that when you read the words of, say, some church fathers when they're saying things, you're reading words that we have now given new meaning and understand to apply in a different way. And you can sometimes lose sight of the fact that no, they were talking about something else. And this was their way of talking about it. We've just changed. We've kept the code. We've just changed what the code meant. And so I found this, what I would call this dishonest disagreement with science that was constantly going on. And in discovering this, somebody then recommended to me an excellent book that I got a hold of, written by Andrew Dixon White, called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. It's quite a book. And if you read it, he's documented some of the more major problems that Christianity in its theology has had with scientists over the years. And he looks back at generations gone by and the arguments they were having, arguments that some of you wouldn't believe that Christians were having those arguments. Sometimes you try and tell Christians today that there was a time when their ancestors were arguing with the scientists about this. They will deny that they were. They don't even really know the history. There's not just the dome of the earth, but the sphericity of the earth was something that was a big issue when scientists were kind of first discovering that, no, the earth is really a sphere. The idea that there might be inhabitants on some other aspect of the globe was something that was heatedly denied. Even Augustine had problems with that. Procopius of Gaza, these people argued against it. In fact, sometimes this guy, Procopius, was actually quoted by Mormons as because he dealt with some of the issue about how if there were people on the other side of the earth, then Christ would have to go visit them, and stuff like that. Christianity has argued with scientists when they began to discuss the size of the earth. The size of the earth became unmanageable for certain possible biblical events to have occurred, or for certain biblical descriptions to work the way they do. Things with even mapping, or the way maps work, the placement of things, whether or not Jerusalem is in the center of the earth and all this stuff. Christians have argued with scientists and geologists and people who study these things, and they're not trying to do anything other than be honest with what it is they're finding. And they're finding themselves constantly becoming the enemies of Christians, who will perceive the scientists as being the enemy of faith and the enemy of God, and saying things because they're inspired by Satan, which is an amazing thing in light of what, in fact, if we were to characterize truth, lie, it seems to me that would fit more into that argument of these people being inspired by Satan than anybody, if you want to follow that kind of an argument. And we got a viewer comment here. Let's see what we got. Do you think that the content, the meaning of some of the words that some musicians write, the ideas that they convey out of their wild spirits that promote bad behavior, should be kept from hitting our ears and brains repeatedly every time we play their songs? You're going to have to make that decision for yourself. When the Beatles sing, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," it's a little different from when they were singing, "Why Don't We Do It in the Road?" Or some people were like really bothered when the first album came out, "Please, Please Me," the innuendo. I suppose that that all art has often flirted with sexuality, and I don't see a problem with that. Sexuality is a part of who we are, and the church has, in my opinion, had an overly prudish view of it all, so that I think that some of these things that are perhaps a bit suggestive, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's amazing to me how many people listen to this stuff and don't even have any idea what the words are, or even really stop to think about some of the innuendo. But it's not all that way. But a lot of pop culture tends to be immature and faddish, and I suppose that it may be something we go through. But as to whether or not it's good to have that in your ears constantly, I think you're going to have to make that decision for yourself. Now, I'll be honest with you. As much as I'm a Beatles fan, and as much as I enjoy secular music and play the guitar, I personally don't like all those songs that seem to want to glorify getting high and doing drugs, and what was that song that used to be very popular back? I think, I can't remember when it first came out, but if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. I gotta be honest with you, songs like that don't really speak to me. And there's some songs that the bands I've played with would say, "Hey, let's do that song," and I'd have to say, "Come on, maybe there's some good riffs in it and stuff like that, but I'm sure we can find something else." So it's not as if it's not as if we have to go through this extreme of being, "Hey, just say yes to all of it," or say no to all of it. You can make your choices within it, and there are some choices I make, and there's some excellent music out there from some people who put together some songs that really speak to us, that we really can relate to, songs that talk to us about life, talk to us about love, talk to us about the experience of falling in love, even when we do it immaturely. And I don't think that these songs are necessarily bad. I got to tell you that sometimes, although I'm not a fan of uh, Eminem, I've listened to some of his lyrics. I think he is profound at times. I think he is making a statement that needs to be said. I think people like Bob Dylan represented a social conscience that was fantastic. And questions about our culture. I think John Lennon's Imagine. Although I don't think his solution is a workable one, I think the questions he's asking and the problems he's seeing in the way we're currently doing things, we're extremely useful and astute. How can you complain about all you need is love? Of course, I remember one time hearing that the people at the Bible school I went to were long after I left there were complaining about this group called Glad a cappella because they had songs that had words that just repeated too much, and it was like a pagan chant. I mean, come on. If there is a song that you feel isn't appropriate, don't sing it. Don't listen to it if you don't want to. So it doesn't really matter what these things are because I think that you can make your own decisions for yourself, and you should. You're responsible for your own life, and I think there's room in a lot of so-called art, a lot of so-called music to say, I don't like that. I don't like this. I remember one time a Christian woman once said to me, and it kind of surprised me. She said, "Don't you think, though, that there is something in pornography that shows the beauty of the woman?" And my reaction was, yeah, but I don't think I really handle it all that well, And but there's the sense in which you have to make your decisions as to just where you're going to go and where you're not going to go and what you're going to experiment with and what and things like that. Other than that, I don't know. Let's see. I wanted to get back to I think I covered that comment. Let me get back to some of these other things that I was talking about. Science, I found, was constantly bumping its head with Christianity. Last thing I mentioned was like the size of the earth, and that this was an issue. And in fact, even Columbus, when talking about going out on this voyage, there are a lot of people in the church who thought, we can't let this man do this. He's going to, if he comes back and he just says this or even thinks he's found this or found that, he's going to, it's going to destroy faith. And there was all this religious opposition to what he was doing. But one of the huge, big faux pas that I think that I looked at when I was studying this was the universe, the solar system concept of the heliocentric versus the terracentric view of the Earth. There was a time when, in fact, I guarantee you, most Christians couldn't even quote the verses. They wouldn't even know those verses were there. And I've talked to Christians who would even get angry at me for suggesting there was a time when Christians firmly stood on the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe and did so for what they felt were biblical reasons. They had built a theology about the importance of man and the importance and the centrality of man in the plan of God and the plan of God in dealing with the earth and how this was there. And these people would argue about how even, in the Psalms where we talk about how the sun runs its course across the sky, they would take these things as literal and various other phrases in the scripture, and they opposed the the discoveries of Copernicus. Now, Copernicus published his works in 1543. Actually, he was on his deathbed when he allowed the publication. Somewhat stalled because he knew it was going to be big trouble. A lot of Christians don't realize that this flew in the face of biblical interpretation and of theology for both Catholic and Protestant movements for 150 years. Both Catholic and Protestant churches condemned Copernicus, claiming that he was destroying the Bible, claiming he was destroying faith, claiming he was an agent of Satan, and denying heatedly that there was any truth to the things that he was saying. But unfortunately, along would come some people who would do the math. look through the telescopes, plot the course, look at the understanding of physics at the time, and they would look at it and they go, he's right. Copernicus is right. They do the math and they'd realize the guy is right. Galileo was one of them. Galileo agreed with Copernicus. And since Galileo was so involved in the church forced upon him to recant. And of course, the story goes that he recanted publicly. He condemned Copernicus and, repented of having ever agreed with him. And of course, in doing so, they say that he muttered under his breath at the moment he gave this verbal condemnation, "It's still true, though." This man was abused for his intellectual and scholarly honesty because of these ideas that were taken from the Bible that Christians felt that they understood. Now, today, most Christians read those verses and don't even realize as they read them that they're reading them as merely figures of speech. But back then, they were not read as figures of speech because back then they were not figures of speech. Back then, people really believed that the sun's the sky. They believed it. And when the Bible said so, they weren't saying, oh, it's just a figure of speech. It was not a figure of speech. It was their observation of what it appeared to them to be. And then now we read it, and of course we still talk about sunrise and sunset, and the sun doesn't rise, it doesn't set. The earth spins, and the sun comes into view, and it falls out of view, and that's what's really going on. And but this language of the Bible was finally turned around, and now Christians read it, changing their interpretation. But a lot of Christians today are totally unaware of the fact that we had this argument with the findings of Copernicus for 150 years. But it's not just the obstinate refusal of Christianity to listen to what the scientists had to say. The thing that I find most interesting about this is just they condemned so much and so many people. But here is the real faux pas. Although scholars throughout history would occasionally find themselves bumping heads with the church throughout all of Christian history, sometimes it was an okay battle, or they just, wouldn't focus on that and they could still continue on with the church. They just say, well, the church is mistaken about this, but we can work with this. Not everybody's perfect. But when it came to Copernicus, this was a thing that was so huge that prior to Copernicus, there were a great number of scholars, scientists, specialists in a wide variety of fields of study who were very devout people. But 150 years after Copernicus, there were a great number of scholars who had come to the conclusion the church is false, its teachings are wrong, they are anti-science, they are anti-truth, and we find that Copernicus was the turning point. After Copernicus, most scholars wanted nothing to do with the church because they knew the church was wrong in its interpretation. They didn't just believe differently. They knew something was wrong. I have another comment here. When you make yourself the perfect holder of all truth before the eyes of the whole world, it seems that you will commit murder to avoid admitting that you were ever wrong. It not only seems that way, that's our history. When you see some of the horrendous evil that has been committed by the church to protect its theology, the people we've murdered, the people we've burned at the stake, the people whose lives we have turned not just into misery, but denied them their lives. This is an arrogance that is just full of not only denial, but a love of power, a lust for abuse. An attraction to the people who loved the power that the church gave to them, and the authority and the right to thereby be sanctioned and have permission to do a great deal of abuse. The history is not a pretty one, but it was with Copernicus that the church actually took a turning point. It was after the Copernicus issue was settled, even though the church, both Protestant and Catholic, by 150 years, by around the year 1700, even though the church is now admitting that, yes, this is a solar system, the sun is kind of in the center, and we have planets that are in orbit around the sun. Although the church was willing to admit it, it was too late. Its credibility had been destroyed. Its obstinance and its anger and its arrogance and its refusal to be reasonable had reached such a pinnacle that by this time, the secular scholarship of the world is really very comfortable going in a very different direction from the church. And it has gotten only worse until now. I think it's actually gotten to the point where I have to say the secular scholarship at times is a little bit too big for its own britches too. But, they have been fighting with Christianity for so long, where 95% of the time the Christianity was absolutely not only wrong, but didn't even have a leg to stand on. They're just holding on to a tradition. God said so. It says it in his word. Therefore, I don't care what else you say, what else might be true. I don't care what evidence you have. I will find a way of spinning it as false. This told me that the church had a history of being the enemy of truth. And this was something that, in realizing this, made me realize I not only have permission to go down an unconventional path, I have to. I must. I can't continue this path. Now, it didn't destroy my faith. It didn't take away the reality of the presence of God or the sense of the love of God or the reality of that relationship. But it certainly forced me to say, I have to take a completely different look at the way Christianity tells its story, claims its theology, and determines its authority and its position. I had to go in a very different view. In fact, it caused me to actually go back to school. And eventually, I went to a secular university a couple of times. I went and got a degree in accounting and computer science, went back again, got a degree where I majored in human development and minored in linguistic anthropology, and studied these things from the standpoint of a peer-reviewed rigorous discipline of genuine study and honesty that I feel was radically different than the kind of study that I had in the two different Bible schools that I had attended previously. And it left me going down a completely unconventional path. Since then, there have been so many other issues that many people don't even really remember. You might pick up yourself a copy of that book by Andrew Dixon White about the history of the warfare between theology and science in Christendom, and take a look at some of the things that it has to say. And there have been many issues that have grown up since then. There were times when Christians were arguing with scientists about germs, about the need for hygiene, about the nature of mental health and the nature of philology and linguistics. And they argue about everything they think they know everything about just because they believe in God. And the Bible said something that they, in their uneducated way, understood it to mean this, and that's it. That settles it. I'm done. I'm not interested in what real scholars have to say. I think that in some sense, this is exactly what we're going through in the issues today. The issues of, say, creationism versus evolution. Now, I don't buy into the whole creation story. I don't buy into the whole evolution story, but I do believe in evolution. I do believe that it is an absolutely valid way of understanding the nature and the dynamic of the biology that exists and that is currently a part of what we're going through. I think that they have a lot to say about the process and the age of the earth and things that are going on. The only thing that I would do is as a creationist, I just subscribe to the idea that it is God who is responsible for all this, and let the scientists explain to us what the results were. I have no desire to argue with any scientist about any of the things that they find in terms of all of that. And I think that we are just continuing this horrible tradition tradition that we've had of fighting against truth. You know, science isn't always perfect. It takes a while to get there, but science has a far more disciplined, rigorous way of getting to the truth, of peer review and things like this. So you know what? I trust the process. I don't expect it to be perfect at every step, but I expect that and find that it gets better every time they take another step. And I find that Christianity that just digs in its heels and holds on to where it's always been as if it has always known the truth, isn't working. And I found it forced me to go down this this unconventional path. Well, anyway, there you have it. I've taken several shows where I've tried to share with you some of the different axes that were at work in my life that brought to me this confrontation with the reality that I find my life was, and that forced me to decide that I had to go down an unconventional path, a path that did not destroy my faith, but a path that certainly forced me to abandon the way and the style of how that faith was being processed and the kind of dogma that it was involved in it. So that's a little bit of my story. Next time I see you, we'll be actually talking about some other kind of theme. But I've enjoyed this, and I hope that if you have any other comments or questions that you'll send them to me and let me know what you're thinking. Thank you for listening. I hope I haven't been too long-winded with you. But this is Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor, and I'll see you again on Wednesday. Take care.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Unconventional Pastor. Always an amazing and thought-provoking discussion. Don't forget to send in your comments and questions to our shows. There are 3 ways to do that. You can text in at 850-572-7441. You can join us in the Ustream chat and text in your comments and questions there. Or you can add comments to our Facebook posts at Kaine Diatheke. Stick around. Jim Palmer and his lovely wife Heather Palmer are going to be guests on The Place with Dr. Michael W. Jones and his lovely wife Rhonda. And you can text in your comments and questions there, and it's going to be an amazing discussion as we close the night.